In our last lesson, we started looking at Tutti orchestration. A reminder, Tutti doesn't necessarily mean that absolutely everyone in the orchestra is playing, but rather just that three or more of the orchestral families are present and not just with single solo lines. In this lesson, I want to look at the first movement of Tchaikovsky's Sixth Symphony. Tchaikovsky was a master orchestrator, and there's much to be learned from the various ways he organizes his Tutti passages. First, let's look at a sort of semi-tutti, starting at rehearsal B in the first movement. I call it a semi-tutti because the heavy brass are not present, but three of the four horns are playing and not in the solo line. In general, Tchaikovsky uses the horns more often than the heavy brass, since they also blend well with most of the woodwind. As usual in a tutti, there are several planes of tone here. Starting in the second half of the measure, the violins have the main upper line, which then passes into the lower strings in imitation. The bassoon provides a counterpoint to the upper strings, which is then imitated in the flutes as the lower strings take over. This is a simple example of how invertible counterpoint can enrich orchestration. It's the same material, but the surface is different. When the flutes arrive, the horns also come in the middle register with the dotted note motive. The whole process is then repeated. This approach requires contrapuntal thinking, and as in real-life counterpoint, rests are important. Not everybody plays all the time. The rests not only lighten the texture, but they also draw attention to the entries of the different motives in imitation. The imitation continues with variations in the orchestration in the following measures. Now let's look at another passage a bit further on, this time including the heavy brass as well. It starts at Un poco animando on page 8. Imitating the woodwind, as before, the strings come in again with the repeated note motive. The woodwind's last note is now overlapped into the strings entry, sustained. Then the heavy brass come in with another motive. As their phrase completes, the horn and bassoon 1 enter, imitating the accented eighth note motive we heard previously in the winds and strings, following the familiar repeated note motive. Now, all the upper woodwinds return with the repeated 16th note motive, overlapping with the brass. To balance the brass, the woodwinds are doubled in 3 octaves. Notice that octave doubling normally sounds louder than unison doubling, all other things being equal. A few bars later, the trumpets and oboes dialogue with horns, trombones, and bassoons and the lower strings. Now the repeated note motive is doubled in upper strings as well as the flutes and clarinets. Notice how the timpani reinforce the low register entries. The rolls make it even more intense. Once again, contrapuntal thinking. Instead of just having everybody play together, motives are exchanged between families in dialogue and imitation. This livens up the texture instead of having everybody simply double in the same lines. Also, again, notice how many rests there are, making the whole more transparent. Next, we arrive at a full tutti where everybody's playing. Even here, there are many subtleties worth noticing. The main line is in violin 1 and 2, doubled by flutes and piccolo. Note how the half of the second violins, as well as the violas, double the violins an octave lower, but only in the first half of the first 2 bars. This creates a kind of dialogue between registers as the motive repeats. Flute 1 has a little change of octave as well. The highest notes, B and C, were not considered playable at that time. In the first bar and a half, the clarinets double the top line as well, but in alternation. The bass line is in the cello and double basses, as well as the tuba, doubled in the second, third, and fourth bars by the bass trombone. But in the second half of the first bar, the bass trombone plays a middle part. Note also the occasional easy double stops in the cello to provide more accent. Beginning in the second half of the second bar, the violas also have easy double stops for the same reason. The timpani continue to reinforce the bass line. Since they can't play all the notes, they play chord tones instead. Note the tremolos in the first two bars, underlining the eighth note dialogue. In the first bar here, trumpets and octaves along with oboes dialogue with horns 1 and 3 and bassoon 1 with the accented eighth note motive. The rest of the time, the horns, bassoons, and the alto and tenor trombones fill in the harmony. What's especially striking is that if you look at any of the doublings on this page, almost none of them are 100% consistent from bar to bar. For example, look at the bassoons. They generally double trombones 1 and 2, except that in the second half of the first bar, bassoon 1 switches to reinforcing the horns and the violas, and bassoon 2 doubles the bass note. Or look at the clarinets. They only start doubling the trumpets in the second half of the second bar. Notice how the timpani, along with the lower instruments, have rests at the end of the second and fourth beats. These rests help keep the texture transparent, not too heavy. At rehearsal D, the tutti quiets down. Here the upper strings continue the main line, but the bass line and the harmonic filler are in lower woodwind and lower strings. The low brass return only at the end of the third bar with a final echo. We see here that Tchaikovsky doesn't just copy lines mechanically between instruments. Rather, he's put considerable effort into individualizing most of the lines. Even though this is not a typical contrapuntal texture like a fugue, this kind of refinement of detail can only be mastered through a serious study of counterpoint. Even when nobody is playing, the sound is never gray or monotonous. In our next lesson, we'll look at some Tutti orchestration by Stravinsky.